Story 1. The Wrong Turn. It was supposed to be a quick drive home. I had visited a friend in a neighboring town and stayed later than I intended, leaving just after 10 p.m. The drive usually took about 45 minutes, all through back roads and winding highways. I had taken that route dozens of times, but that night, I made a mistake that still haunts me. The GPS on my phone started acting up not long after I left my friend's house. The signal flickered in and out, and for some reason, the screen froze, making me miss my usual turnoff. I groaned and pulled over to the side of the road, trying to reset it. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from my headlights, casting long, distorted shadows on the trees lining the road. There wasn't a single other car around, and everything felt unnaturally still. After what felt like forever, the GPS finally rebooted, and I realized I had veered off course by about 10 miles. It rerouted me to a different road, a shortcut that would supposedly cut across and get me back on track. I didn't think much of it. I was tired and just wanted to get home, so I took the new route. Big mistake. The road it led me onto wasn't really a road at all. It was more of a dirt path, narrow, overgrown, and rough. The trees on either side were thick, their branches almost closing in over the top like a tunnel. I had to slow down to a crawl to avoid hitting any potholes, and the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. My car headlights barely cut through the oppressive darkness ahead. I kept telling myself it was fine. It was just a back road. I'd be back on the main highway soon enough. But with every passing minute, that confidence eroded. The trees seemed to press in tighter, and the silence was unnerving. Even the hum of my car felt swallowed by the stillness around me. I checked the time, 10:45 p.m. I should have been halfway home by now, but instead, I felt like I was driving into nowhere. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a movement in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I glanced back again, I saw it clearly. There was a figure standing on the road behind me. A person, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't passed anyone. The road was deserted. How could they have gotten behind me? I kept my eyes locked on the rearview mirror, watching the figure. They weren't moving, just standing there, about 50 feet back, half hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details. It was just a silhouette. My mind raced. Was it someone in trouble? Lost? But why would they be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour? Something felt off. Way off. I stared at the figure for what felt like forever, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. And then, slowly, the figure stepped toward my car. Instinctively, I floored the gas. My car jerked forward, the tires spinning in the loose gravel as I sped down the path. The figure disappeared from my rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something dangerous. I drove as fast as I could, my car bouncing over the rough terrain. The trees were flying past in a blur, the path ahead barely visible. I just kept telling myself to get back to the highway, get out of this place. Suddenly, something slammed against my passenger side window. I screamed, swerving so hard that I nearly drove off the road. I managed to straighten out the car, heart pounding so loud I could hardly hear anything else. But when I glanced at the passenger seat window, it was completely shattered, glass everywhere, shards in the seat, some still clinging to the frame. But the most horrifying thing? A handprint was smeared across the broken glass, clear and distinct in the moonlight. Someone had tried to grab my car. They had been right there, inches away from me. Panic surged through me. I sped up even more, the car shaking as it struggled over the uneven ground. I kept glancing at the shattered window, half expecting a hand to reach inside and grab me. But there was nothing, just the jagged edge of broken glass and the cold night air rushing in. But then I saw something else in the distance. At first, it looked like a flash of light, just ahead, bouncing between the trees. As I got closer, I realized it was headlights. Relief washed over me, another car. Finally, someone else was on this road. But then the panic set in again. The headlights weren't moving. They were parked, As I approached, I slowed down, unsure of what I was about to see. There, at the side of the road, was an old, beat-up truck. Its engine was off, the headlights still on, casting long shadows across the trees. And standing next to it were two men. They were just standing there, watching me as I drove past. Their faces were hidden under hoods, but their posture told me everything I needed to know. They were waiting for me. I didn't stop. I didn't even think. I hit the gas and sped past them, my heart racing out of control. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw them get into the truck and start following me. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some random encounter. They were after me. I pushed my car to its limit, the engine roaring as I swerved around corners and dodged potholes. But the truck was gaining on me, its massive frame barreling down the path. My mind raced with every possibility. Would they run me off the road? Would they try to block me in? Just when I thought I couldn't outrun them, I saw it. The flickering lights of the highway ahead. I could have cried in relief. I floored the gas one last time, skidding onto the pavement just as the truck's headlights disappeared into the trees behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I drove all the way home, shaking, my pulse still racing. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, just trying to calm down. The shattered window was proof that it had all been real. That handprint, that chase, those men. I never drove that back road again. And I never found out who they were or what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure. If I hadn't made it to the highway in time, I'm not sure I'd be here telling this story. Story 2. The Neighbor Next Door. It started out as the kind of situation you see on the news. The stories you shake your head at and think, that would never happen to me. But it did. I moved into my first solo apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood a few months ago. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect for someone like me, small, simple, and just enough space. My neighbors all seemed friendly enough, except for the guy next door. I didn't even know his name. He was older, maybe mid-40s, and always seemed to be home, just hanging around his porch. Every time I left my apartment, he'd be sitting there, staring, not saying anything, just staring. At first, I thought it was weird but harmless. People are awkward sometimes, right? But after a few weeks, I started feeling uneasy. No matter what time of day I left or came home, there he was, always on that porch, always watching. The worst part? He never acknowledged me. He never waved, smiled, or spoke, just watched with this blank, unsettling look on his face. One night, I got home late from work, around 11 p.m. It had been a long day, and all I wanted to do was collapse in a bed. As I parked my car and started walking toward my building, I glanced at his porch out of habit. It was empty. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't sitting there. I felt a wave of relief, thinking maybe he wasn't home or had finally gotten bored of his silent surveillance. But as I got closer to my front door, that relief vanished. There was something on my doormat. I hesitated before getting closer, squinting in the dim light of the porch lamp. It was a small, yellow sticky note placed right in front of my door. "I like the way you smile." My blood ran cold. I looked around, trying to see if anyone was out there. My neighbor's lights were off, but my skin prickled with the feeling that I was being watched. I grabbed the note, rushed inside, and locked the door behind me. I stood there for a few minutes, heart pounding in my chest, listening for any sound, any sign that someone was out there. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. A prank. Maybe a kid from the neighborhood being weird. I went about my day, went to work, came home, and there he was again, back on his porch, watching me. Only now, there was something different about the way he looked at me. Like he knew something. I started avoiding going out unless absolutely necessary. If I had to leave, I'd wait until I thought he wasn't home. I stopped sitting on my own porch, keeping the blinds drawn almost all the time. But the notes kept coming. Every few days, I'd find another one. They were never threatening, just unnerving. "I like your hair. You smell nice. I'll see you soon." That last one, it made my skin crawl. I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the building manager and reported it, but they didn't do much. They said they couldn't prove it was him, and since the notes weren't directly threatening, their hands were tied. I even thought about calling the police, but without evidence, what could I do? They just dismissed me as paranoid. One night, I woke up at around 3 a.m. I wasn't sure what woke me at first, but then I heard it, a faint creaking noise. I sat up in bed, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. My heart was racing, and I strained to listen, barely breathing. It was coming from the hallway outside my door. My apartment was small, just a one-bedroom with a tiny living space and kitchen. The front door led straight into the living room, and I knew the sound I was hearing was someone outside. The slow, deliberate creak of someone walking up to my door. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed toward the door, careful not to make any noise. The peephole. I could check the peephole. I crept closer, every muscle in my body tense, the only sound my own ragged breathing. When I finally reached the door, I slowly leaned in, pressing my eye against the peephole, praying there would be nothing there. But there was. My neighbor. He was standing inches from the door, his face so close I could almost feel his breath. His eyes were wide, darting back and forth like he was listening for something. And then, slowly, his hand came up, and he ran his fingers lightly down the doorframe. I backed away from the door, clapping my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. My phone was in my hand, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly he spoke. Not loudly. Almost a whisper, but just loud enough for me to hear through the door. I know you're in there. I dropped my phone, the clatter echoing through the apartment. He must have heard it because his fingers stopped moving. The next thing I knew, he was rattling the doorknob, trying to force it open. I panicked, running for the bedroom and locking myself in. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. I called the police, trying to keep my voice low, but I was practically sobbing. He was pounding on the door now, harder and harder, like he was desperate to get in. Let me in. Let me in. I just want to talk. His voice was frantic, manic even, like he was losing control. I huddled in the corner of my room, waiting for the police, the banging getting louder, more violent. I was terrified the door wouldn't hold. I didn't dare leave my bedroom until I heard the sound of sirens, then loud voices shouting from outside. When the police arrived, he was gone. They searched the entire complex, but they couldn't find him. It was like he'd vanished. They took my statement, and I spent the night at a friend's house, too scared to go back. The next morning, I packed up and moved out. I didn't care about breaking the lease or getting my deposit back. I just wanted to get away from that place. But the worst part? The neighbor didn't just disappear. A few weeks after I moved, I got a call from a detective. They had found my neighbor dead. Apparently, he'd been hiding out in the woods behind the apartment complex, living in some makeshift camp. They said he'd been watching me for weeks, taking pictures, writing notes. And in his camp, they found something else. Keys. Copies of my apartment keys. I don't know what he planned to do, and I don't want to think about it. But one thing's for sure. If I hadn't called the police that night, I'm not sure I'd still be here. Story 3. The Man in the Field. I grew up in a small town where nothing ever happened. You know, the kind of place where people don't lock their doors, and the nights are deathly quiet. We lived about a mile down a dirt road, with nothing but open fields for miles around. The isolation never bothered me, until that night. It was a Friday. My parents were out of town for the weekend, and I had the house to myself. It was the middle of October, and the nights were getting colder, so I had all the windows cracked just enough to let the cool air in while I binge-watched some old horror movies. Around 11 p.m., I decided to head to bed. I turned off the TV, locked the front door, and made my way through the house to check the back door. That's when I saw him. There in the middle of the field, standing completely still, was a man. I froze. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but the way he stood, rigid, unblinking, like a statue, made my stomach turn. At first, I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light or my imagination playing tricks on me. But the longer I stared, the more I realized this was real. I could feel my pulse quicken as a chill ran down my spine. Who the hell is out there? And why is he just standing there? I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Probably some farmer or a hunter. He'd move on, right? But he didn't. Instead, he moved toward the house. At first, it was slow, just a few steps. But then he picked up speed, his strides long and purposeful, heading straight for the back door. My heart started hammering in my chest. I rushed to lock the door, but my hands were trembling so badly, I fumbled with the latch. The man was getting closer, and I could see him now, a tall, wiry figure with long, dirty hair obscuring his face. I finally got the door locked, yanking the blinds down just as he reached the back porch. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched by the window, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Please, please go away, I thought to myself. I heard a sharp tap, tap, tap against the glass. I flinched. He was knocking, not pounding, just a soft, deliberate tapping like he was toying with me. I stayed crouched, too terrified to move. My phone was in the living room, but there was no way I was getting up to get it now. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if he knew I was just on the other side. Suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. I slowly rose, just enough to peek through a gap in the blinds. He was gone. I felt a fleeting sense of relief. Maybe he'd left. Maybe it was over. But then, I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the side of the house. I froze. The man wasn't gone. He was circling the house, dragging something sharp along the walls as he moved. I could hear the scratch of metal on wood as he made his way toward the front. Oh God, I thought, panic clawing at me. I scrambled up the stairs, racing to my bedroom. I slammed the door and wedged a chair under the knob. My heart was racing, my breathing erratic. I could feel every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then, the knocking started again. This time, it was coming from the front door. Bang, bang, bang. It wasn't soft anymore. It was loud, forceful, like he was testing the strength of the door. Why isn't anyone else hearing this? My thoughts raced as I grabbed my phone, hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I dialed 911, whispering as quietly as I could that someone was trying to break into my house. The dispatcher told me to stay hidden, that help was on the way. But the knocking grew louder and more frantic, like he was desperate to get in. I could hear him rattling the door handle now, trying to force it open. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering downstairs. He's inside. I barely had time to react before the footsteps started. Slow, heavy thuds echoing through the house as he made his way inside. Each step sounded closer, more deliberate, like he was savoring the chase. I backed into the corner of my room, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear him downstairs, rifling through the kitchen, the sound of drawers being pulled open and slammed shut. Then the footsteps began again, this time coming up the stairs. I bit down on my lip to stop myself from screaming. My hand hovered over my phone, ready to call the police again, but I was too terrified to make a sound. Step, creak, step. He was outside my bedroom door now. I could hear his labored breathing through the wood. The doorknob rattled violently, but the chair held. For a brief moment, I thought it might stop him. Then, I heard a loud crack. The door frame splintered as he threw his weight against it. I pressed myself into the corner, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. He was in the room now. I could hear his heavy boots thudding against the floor as he moved closer. Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air. The flashing blue and red lights illuminated the room as police cars pulled up outside. The man stopped dead in his tracks. I could hear the officers shouting from downstairs. Then silence. When the police made it upstairs, the man was gone. Vanished. The back door was wide open, but there was no sign of him, just an empty field stretching out into the night. They searched for hours, but he was never found, and no one had any idea who he was or what he wanted. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I can still hear the soft tap, tap, tap against the glass and the slow creak of footsteps coming up the stairs.